Hey everyone, welcome in. Ever wondered about the ins and outs of family law in the Philippines? Get ready, because today we're diving deep into the world of paternity, filiation, and legitimacy. And don't worry, we're ditching the legal jargon for a conversation you can actually follow. We've got a stack of fascinating sources in front of us: the family code, civil code, some impactful republic acts, and even some Supreme Court decisions. Our mission: to break down what these laws really mean for families, from the children to the parents and everyone in between. So before we jump into specific cases, let's clarify something. What exactly are we talking about when we say paternity, filiation, and legitimacy? They sound kind of similar, but have distinct meanings in the eyes of the law, right?
Absolutely. It's easy to get those terms mixed up. Think of it this way. Paternity is the biological link between a father and child. Filiation, on the other hand, is the legal recognition of that parent-child relationship. Then there's legitimacy, which is a legal status determined by whether a child was born within a marriage recognized by law.
So it's like building a house. You need a solid foundation, which in this case is paternity. Then comes the framework filiation, providing structure and support. Finally, you have legitimacy, the roof that provides additional security and social standing. But just like any structure, things can get complicated. And speaking of things getting complicated, the family code is like the rule book for family law in the Philippines. One of its big focuses is on the presumption of legitimacy for children born within a marriage. What's the reasoning behind that, and why does it matter so much?
That's a great question. The Family Code emphasizes this presumption to protect a child's rights and their place in society. It's not just about having a legal connection, it's about ensuring access to resources, inheritance, and even things like nationality.
It's interesting how this legal principle aims to provide stability and security for children. But how does this presumption of legitimacy actually play out in real-life situations?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Let's look at the case of James Quaco versus Republic of the Philippines. This case involved a father who wanted to legally recognize his child, but there was a problem. The child was born while the mother was married to someone else.
Okay, so we have a situation where the law and biology might be telling different stories. What did the court say about that?
Even though the father might have been the biological parent, the court ultimately sided with the presumption of legitimacy. Since the child was born during the mother's marriage, they were legally considered legitimate. This case truly emphasizes how seriously Philippine courts view this presumption, even in situations where it might seem at odds with biological reality. It all comes back to safeguarding the child's well-being and social standing.
That's quite a powerful example of how the law prioritizes a child's welfare. But what happens when the law doesn't align with biological reality, and a child needs to prove who their biological father truly is?
That's where the advancements in DNA testing have completely changed the game.
You're right, DNA testing has become a game changer.
It has revolutionized paternity cases. In the past, proving paternity or filiation often relied heavily on witness testimony, documents, or even just physical resemblance. But now, DNA testing offers a level of scientific certainty that was previously unimaginable. Courts have increasingly recognized DNA evidence as a valid and reliable tool in these situations.
So it's no longer a guessing game. It seems like with DNA testing, you have almost undeniable proof.
While it's a powerful tool, it's not always as simple as it seems. The courts still have to look at the bigger picture.
That makes sense. Context is everything. What about cases where DNA testing play a crucial role?
There are actually two cases that showcase this perfectly. The first is Rosendo Herrera versus Rosendo Alba, and the second is Bernie Santiago versus Rommel C. Janation. In both of these cases, despite the presumption of legitimacy being a factor, DNA testing played a crucial role in establishing paternity and ultimately ensuring the rights of the child were protected.
That's incredible. It really highlights how the legal system is adapting to incorporate scientific advancements. It makes you wonder how many cases were decided differently before DNA testing was available.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? This just goes to show how the law is constantly evolving.
It definitely does. Now let's talk about surnames. How does a child's last name play into all of this? What makes having a specific surname so important in these cases?
Well, according to the family code, a child considered legitimate typically takes on the surname of both parents. But of course, it's rarely that simple.
There are always exceptions to the rule.
Exactly. Take the case of Jeannie San Juan de la Cruz versus Ronald Paul S. Gracia, for example.
Yeah.
This case presented a unique situation where the court decided it was in the best interest of the child to carry the surname of her deceased father, even though the circumstances surrounding her birth might have suggested otherwise.
This is what I find fascinating about family law. It's not just about applying rules. It's about navigating the complexities of human relationships.
You hit the nail on the head.
So we've seen how complex it can be to establish paternity and filiation, especially when there are legal hurdles to overcome. But for our listeners who might be in a situation where they need to establish paternity, what are the rules? What kind of evidence does the court look for? And how much is enough?
That's where the burden of proof comes in. If someone is claiming paternity, they are responsible for providing sufficient evidence to support their claim.
So it's not enough to simply say, "This is my father," and expect the court to agree.
Not at all. The court carefully examines various types of evidence. It could be anything from birth certificates to documents containing admissions, witness testimonies, and even something like common reputation within a community.
So it's like building a case, piece by piece, right?
Precisely. And a case we can look at to illustrate this point is Francisco L. Gison versus Court of Appeals. This case demonstrates how meticulous the court is when reviewing evidence in paternity cases. They aren't just looking for any shred of proof. They're looking for solid, credible evidence that leaves no room for doubt.
It makes you realize that establishing a legal family connection is serious business, and the court is there to ensure everything is above board.
Exactly. It's about ensuring justice for everyone involved.
Now, shifting gears a bit to a topic that often goes hand in hand with family disputes, particularly when it comes to paternity, inheritance. It's a topic that can get complicated quickly. So, for those who might not be familiar with Philippine law, do children considered illegitimate have any legal rights to inherit property from their father?
That's a great question, and the answer isn't as simple as a yes or no. While children considered illegitimate under the law can inherit from their fathers, there are specific requirements they need to meet. It's not automatic.
So there are hoops to jump through. What do they need to do to establish their right to inherit?
The key here is formal acknowledgement. The father needs to have formally acknowledged the child as his own, and this needs to be documented appropriately. This acknowledgement can be done in a couple of ways, either through a public document, like a will, or a private handwritten statement. The important thing is that there is a clear, documented intention from the father's side to recognize the child as his own.
So a heartfelt letter tucked away in a drawer somewhere might not be enough.
Unfortunately, it might not hold up in court. Clarity and formality are key here.
That makes sense. It protects both parties involved, right?
Exactly. And to understand how this plays out in real-life scenarios, we can turn to a couple of cases. The first is Alejandra Arado Ayers versus Anacleto Alcaron. This case, along with another one, Mario Chiang Bernardo versus Jose C. Fernando, shows how the court meticulously analyzes evidence to determine if a child's right to inherit is valid. They look for that clear and undeniable proof of recognition from the father.
It really highlights how crucial the right documentation is, especially regarding inheritance. These cases bring to light the intricacies of family relationships. But before we dive into more case studies, let's take a quick pause. What are your initial thoughts on all of this? Are you starting to see how essential it is to have a clear understanding of these legal principles?
Absolutely. It's fascinating how these legal concepts play out in real-life situations, showcasing the balance between protecting children's rights and ensuring legitimate claims.
It's like walking a tightrope, isn't it?
Yeah.
You want to make sure children aren't unfairly denied their rightful inheritance, but at the same time, preventing false claims is crucial. The courts really have their work cut out for them.
Exactly. And that's why these cases are so important. They provide a glimpse into how the law is interpreted and applied in these complex situations.
Speaking of complex situations, the case of Romeo F. Era versus Dref Elias Pizarro comes to mind. This case really highlights how important it is to have solid proof, especially when it comes to inheritance and property rights. What were your thoughts on the court's decision in that case?
Well, in that particular case, the court ultimately denied the claims of illegitimate filiation because, despite the arguments presented, the evidence wasn't strong enough to warrant a ruling in their favor. It really drives home the point that it's not enough to simply claim a relationship. The court needs to be presented with, well, compelling evidence that can withstand scrutiny, you know?
So it's not enough to just say, "Hey, that's my father," and expect the court to take your word for it. There have to be documents, witnesses, or even DNA evidence to back up the claim.
Absolutely. The court needs to be convinced, and that often means, building a strong case with multiple pieces of evidence that all point to the same conclusion.
That makes sense. It needs to be undeniable. Now, we've talked about illegitimate children inheriting from their fathers, but what about inheritance from other relatives, like, say, a grandparent? Does the same principle apply?
That's a great question, and the answer, unfortunately, isn't always straightforward. It can get even more complicated when you start bringing in extended family members.
Because now you're dealing with a whole other set of relationships and legal considerations, right?
Exactly. And that's where cases like Emley and Ende versus Roman Catholic prelate provide valuable insights. This case grappled with the rights of legitimate heirs and how filiation affects inheritance in those situations, particularly when dealing with extended family. It demonstrated just how intricate these cases can become.
It sounds like something you definitely want an expert to weigh in on.
Absolutely. Having a legal expert who can navigate the intricacies of these laws is essential.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to another case that I think our listeners will find really interesting. Maria Rosario DeSantis versus Honorable Adoration G. Angeles. This case really highlighted how the legal landscape has evolved. What were some of the key takeaways from that case?
What really stood out in that case was the stark contrast between how children's rights were viewed under the civil code compared to the modern-day family code. It illustrated how the Philippines has increasingly recognized the rights of children, regardless of their parents' marital status at the time of their birth. It's a testament to how societal values and, in turn, the law have progressed.
It's a reminder that the law is not static. It's constantly adapting to changing societal norms.
Precisely. It's a reflection of our evolving understanding of family structures.
It makes you appreciate the importance of staying informed about these changes, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, one last case before we move on to the bigger picture. Isabel de la Puerta versus the Honorable Court of Appeals and Carmelita de la Puerta. Now, this case was particularly fascinating because it involved a spurious child, a term some listeners might not be familiar with.
You're right. It's not a term you hear every day. To put it simply, spurious children refers to children born from relationships where the parents were legally prohibited from marrying each other, perhaps due to a close blood relation.
So even if a child born from this type of relationship can prove their biological connection, their legal rights might still be impacted. It seems like a complicated situation. What happened in this particular case?
Well, in this case, while the court acknowledged the child's filiation, they were still legally considered spurious and, as a result, were not granted the right to inherit from their alleged grandmother's estate.
So these circumstances surrounding a child's birth can have a significant impact on their legal rights, even if they can prove their biological connection.
Unfortunately, that is the case in this specific situation, yes. It underscores the fact that the legal definition of family doesn't always align with biological reality. And, it brings to light the human impact these laws can have. It's something to reflect on.
It definitely is. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the presumption of legitimacy to the use of DNA evidence, and even touched upon the sensitive topic of inheritance. What would you say is the main takeaway for our listeners when it comes to paternity and filiation in the Philippines? What do they really need to understand?
I think the key takeaway is this. Establishing legal family relationships is absolutely crucial. It's not just about biology. It's about securing essential legal rights and protections for everyone involved. It's about ensuring clarity and fairness.
So if someone is facing any of these issues, it's not something to handle lightly or assume things will work themselves out.
Exactly. Seeking legal advice and understanding your rights and responsibilities under Philippine law is essential. It's always better to be informed and proactive, especially when it comes to such important matters as family.
Well said. Now, you mentioned DNA evidence earlier, which brings up a really interesting point about how technology has impacted these types of cases. It really makes you think about how technology has revolutionized the way we approach these complex family matters. It's no longer solely reliant on personal testimonies or subjective interpretations.
Exactly. DNA testing has provided a level of certainty that was unimaginable in the past. It's transformed the legal landscape regarding paternity and filiation, making it much harder to dispute biological connections.
It's almost like having that undeniable piece of the puzzle, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. However, it's important to remember that while DNA evidence is powerful, it doesn't automatically dictate the court's decision. The legal process is still designed to consider all aspects of a case.
That makes sense. There's always a human element to consider. We're talking about families, relationships, and the well-being of those involved, not just legal technicalities. Speaking of the human element, all of these cases we've discussed really highlight how the law is continually adapting to the complexities of family structures, societal values, and technological advancements. It's a lot to keep up with.
It certainly is. And, well, it makes you wonder, what's next for family law in the Philippines?
That's a great question. Are there any current legal developments or discussions happening right now that our listeners should know about?
There are definitely some interesting conversations happening within legal circles. For instance, there's ongoing discussion about the legal rights of children born through assisted reproductive technologies, a topic that has become increasingly relevant as technology advances.
That's a whole other layer of complexity, especially when you think about traditional family structures and how they are evolving. It will be interesting to see how the legal system adapts to these new realities.
It certainly will. And that's not all. There's also a broader conversation happening about how we define family in the modern age. This ongoing dialogue could have significant implications for filiation and inheritance laws in the coming years. It's a fascinating time for family law, that's for sure.
It really is. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the intricacies of paternity, filiation, and legitimacy under Philippine law, what's the most important message we want our listeners to walk away with today?
Well, I think even though the law can often seem complex and overwhelming, understanding even the fundamental principles can empower individuals to navigate these situations and protect their rights.
Right.
And never underestimate the importance of seeking guidance from legal professionals when needed.
Knowledge is power.
Absolutely. Especially when it comes to something as essential as family.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And on that note, for our listeners, remember that what we've covered today is just a starting point. There's a whole universe of legal complexities out there, and we encourage you to keep those brains buzzing and never stop asking